All right. So let's get up to speed here. Of course, we're still studying narrative, looking at narratives. The narrative analysis has been our focus. So at this point, and if you'll remember those four parts of it, when we look at stories in the Bible, or really any stories, there's usually these four components. There are a few others that are mentioned as well, but I've incorporated them into these. We have the setting of the story, so it's important to understand what the background is, the where, the when, the who, the culture. Those aspects need to understand um, what's involved in the story, and then of course breaking the story down into its scenes, where we're looking at each part of the story. Um, each block of the story is broken into the scene. These are the building blocks of the story, where a particular scene represents an event that's important to understand as it is connected to the other events, as we're going to talk about in a moment. The character analysis, that's a part of this process where we actually focus attention on the characters within the story. Who are the primary characters? Again, who's the protagonist? That is the main character. Who's the antagonist? That is the one who opposes the main character or creates a problem for the main character. And then we have the what we call foils, if you'll remember. Those are other characters in the story that seem to be in the story to provide a contrast or a comparison or to highlight, focus attention on the main characters. And then there's other characters in the story that are just part of the story that may not have a significant role, but they're just part of the events that took place within the story. So we've spent time, the many sessions before, just looking at those three parts: the setting, the scene, and the characters. Today, I'd like to introduce the fourth and really the part of narrative analysis that brings everything together as far as studying the story, and that's the plot. That's the plot of the story. Um, so as we think about plot, I just want to maybe throw the question out to you, brothers. What, how would you define the plot of a story? What is a plot? Uh, Anybody? How would you explain it, just in a brief way?
Plan of the story.
The what of the story? I'm sorry.
The plan.
The plan. Okay, that's a good way to put it. The plan of the story. Whose plan?
God's plan.
Okay. How about you, Shulong? How would you define plot? Story's plot.
It's actually the storyline that's designed by the author. I mean um the creator, the story creator, in order to and move them with the time, even from the end to the beginning, or to the beginning to the end.
That's good. So I like the idea of there's an intention behind it. The author has an intention to give a message, right? And that the parts of the story are connected together. What happens at the beginning, in the middle, the end, they're linked together. Is that what you're describing?
Yeah, and and the intention will be show with the climax of the when the proof move on, the plot move on.
Yes. Yeah, good. Good. I like that. And I like that word intention. I think that's an important um, part of that. So when we think of a plot, I would say just a simple description would be it's a sequence of events that are interconnected or related to one another. Um, that the author reveals there's a point to the story, really. There's a message from the story that the author wants the reader to understand. And so the plot really is the unfolding of that main point. There can be, you can read something and it can be a description of events, but that doesn't mean there's a plot, right? You can read a newspaper article, perhaps, that's describing some event that took place, but just because it's describing an event or some events doesn't mean there's a story there. Doesn't mean there's a plot to that story. Okay, this is an important distinction that I think we need to recognize when we talk about plot. Because a plot occurs when the author makes a connection, that there's an intention behind the author to connect these events. That he's not just telling us what happened, but that he's telling us what happened with an intention to have those events connected together to give us a message. Let me give you an example. Here's a statement that this describes two events that took place. A man died and then his wife died. This can be a story, but it lacks a plot. Now, if you say a man died and then his wife died from grief, now you're developing a plot. You've connected those events together to communicate a message. All right. And so I think that's an important distinction, that again, a plot is a sequence of events that are interrelated or connected to one another. Right? There's a point behind them. That's a plot. Otherwise, you just have events that are being described, but not necessarily a connection between those events that the author is trying to communicate through that. So, for example, there's a difference between what a plot is and what it does. So a plot is a series of events, again, related to each other. And through that, the plot reveals the point the author wants to communicate, or the message, we could word it this way, the message of the story. All right. Does that make sense? The distinction I'm trying to make here? I mean, you can tell, events that took place, right? You can describe what happened to you yesterday, or what you experienced, or a story you read about, or something like that. But that's not necessarily a plot. That could just be you're just telling a story. But if there's an intention by you in describing those events, that you have a message you want to communicate. For example, let's say your message is, yesterday was a wonderful day. At the beginning of the day, I had this amazing breakfast with my wife, and we spent time together. And then after that, I had a time of prayer. And, so you could describe these events that are connected to each other because you have a message that you want to say, yesterday was a wonderful day. Let me explain to you how it was a wonderful day. And so you describe these events that connect to that theme. All right. But if you're just telling events that took place, that's not necessarily a plot. That's just describing events that took place. And so it's important we understand when we're looking at a story that with a plot, that means the author is describing events, characters, situations, dialogue, describing these things that took place with the intent to give a message through those events and how they're connected together. And so as we look at, in the Bible, a particular book of the Bible, we recognize there is a plot. There's a message behind that book. There's a purpose that the author has in giving us that book. We were looking at John before, right? And his purpose was to describe, to convince the reader that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, so that the reader would believe and have life in his name. And so we learn, that's really the main plot of the story, is that we would see Jesus is a divine and human, and that we would believe in him. And so the events that are described in the Gospel of John are not just stories of historical happenings, but actually are historical events that are given in a particular order and sequence and described in a particular way in order to communicate that message, that plot, that main idea of the story. Okay? Any questions on that? Does that make sense? Any clarifications?
Yeah, Pastor Tim, can I ask two questions? Based on the example just now, right? A man died, his wife died, and they can become two independent statements that are not connected. However, the second or subsequent example say a man died, then his wife died because of grief or died from grief, right? So my first question is, in order to see the plot, does it mean then we have to pay attention to conjunctions in the narratives, especially either the causation conjunctions or resultant conjunctions?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sometimes you'll see story, you know, in a book, you'll see some of the stories presented or introduced, and there'll be a link. I think we even I think an example came to my mind. John 4. Let's look at this. This is a really good question. All right, of course, John 4 is you know, Jesus when he meets the Samaritan woman at the well. Notice how John, in John chapter 3, right? We just had was of course the Jesus's interaction with Nicodemus, being born again. And then following that, notice there's a connection here. After these things, right, then we have the witness of John the Baptist regarding who Jesus is. And then notice chapter 4. Look at the first word. Therefore, when Jesus knew that, so here he's linking this next story to what came before. And so we have these connections as you can look at each of the stories. For example, John chapter 3, we have after these things, Jesus and his, so following the events of Nicodemus, John the Apostle then describes events related to John the Baptist and the identity of Christ. In fact, remember, it takes us back to chapter 1 when John says, you yourselves are my witnesses. I said, I am not the Christ. I've been sent ahead of him. Well, that takes us back to chapter 1, doesn't it? When John was the identity of John the Baptist as well as Christ. But then we get to chapter 4, and then we have another story being introduced, but it's not independent or disconnected from what's happened before. And so oftentimes we will get these kind of links. If we go to the end of chapter 4, after the story of his interaction with the Samaritans, verse 43, after the 2 days that he spent in Samaria, he went from there to Galilee. For Jesus himself, there's a conjunction for, it's connecting what's about to happen with what just happened. And it's explaining, okay, why he went to Galilee. He came to Cana, and then of course we have so yeah, when you're you know, preaching through or teaching through or studying or reading through a narrative, pay attention to how the author may be making connections between the various stories. Again, they're not a situation where, you know, John the Apostle is sitting there thinking, you know, what were some interesting stories that happened when I was with Jesus? You know, but actually he presents these stories because he's moving us towards the point or the message of his book. And so each story has that connection with the book as a whole. Now, there may be oftentimes, as we see in John's gospel, each story will have perhaps its own plot. This isn't always the case, but often is the case where each story will have, as it fits into the bigger story, each story will have itself a plot. Like John 4, there's a plot in John 4, right? Jesus is interacting with a Samaritan woman. Well, that's a problem, because Jesus was a Jewish holy man who's now talking with this immoral Samaritan woman. And the culture would look at that as a very bad thing. And so this presents a problem within that particular story. And we see through that story, John giving the message of the importance of the Great Commission, really, in reaching all peoples, even the Samaritans. And the disciples didn't see that. So Jesus was teaching them that lesson. So that's sort of a smaller plot, if you will, within the larger one. That story does show Jesus as the Messiah. But at the same time, John's also, from that story, wanted to communicate another principle or theme, and that is regarding outreach. Or John 3 with Nicodemus being born again. There's a theme there, a principle of understanding what it means to be born again. And so John, within that story, is also presenting a smaller or subplot, if you will. But they're still all part of the bigger plot of the whole gospel. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Or
Yeah, thank you. Because you see, the just now, the earlier we mentioned, or you mentioned, that a plot occurs when the authors make a connection between events or interrelated events. So a plot occurs when the authors make connections. So therefore, by paying attention to the conjunction, this is how the author make connections of various events or incidents that happen. So by paying attention to the conjunction, we can see the plot, and in seeing the plot, we can exegete, actually the word, the main point of that particular narratives. Would that be right to say?
in many cases, not all. Sometimes you'll just have a story in there, and the connection is more of a challenge. Like, what the author may not tell us explicitly what that connection is. He'll just say, and then this happened. For example, if we go and got John's gospel, here's the wedding at Cana, right? So John 1, you remember from our study of it a while back, was those 4 days when describing who Jesus was, that, John the Baptist pointing to Christ as the Lamb of God, that he's not the Christ, and then John's disciples coming and understanding who Jesus is. Well, then it says, then we have the wedding at Cana. So it says on the third day. So there's a connection. Okay, what is that, the third day? The third day from the events of chapter 1. So after chapter 1, which focuses on the identity of Christ as the Messiah, the Son of God, then John moves us to 3 days later and this wedding feast, where he gives us the first sign, right, that he describes in verse 11. So, okay, we can see the connection here, but really the only conjunction is the word and on the third day. So there's a link to these stories being put together, but what that link is, we have to understand the story first. So we understand the first story in John 1, that's the identity of Christ. The second story is then his first sign to verify that identity. But then we get to verse 13, and it's just and the Passover was near, and Jesus went to Jerusalem. So that just sounds like a historical, okay, then this happened. But we have to study the story about the zeal, his zeal for God's glory. We have to study that story to understand what was happening in the story, and then try to, okay, so how does this story of him cleansing the temple connect to previous story of the first sign at the wedding of Cana? And so sometimes you may have a conjunction or a connector phrase or clause that gives insight, but sometimes it's just you have to study the story carefully to identify the point of this story of him cleansing the temple. And then why would John describe this story after the first sign at the wedding of Cana? And then before his introduction to Nicodemus and the being born again. So this is where sometimes there's a challenge, because Nicodemus is just introduced by the word now. Now there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus. So this seems like, oh, this is something totally different. Well, it is a new story, but understanding that John is not just randomly collecting stories from the life of Christ, but that he actually intends to link those stories together in some way, then that becomes the challenge for us to understand what that link is. And sometimes it could be a series of stories that are connected together as a section, so to speak. I think that's what's happening here in John 3 and John 4, because you have the story of Nicodemus, and then you have the story of the woman at the well. These are two extended dialogues that Jesus has with one person, and they're really gospel dialogues. Those are unique. You don't see a lot of those in the Gospels, those extended dialogues that Jesus has with just one person. There are some, but John here puts these two dialogues between the first and the second sign. The first sign, the wedding of Cana, then cleansing the temple, then Jesus and Nicodemus. Then we have the second sign is when Jesus heals the centurion's servant. That comes right after the woman at the well. So John seems to have placed the first sign and the second sign together, and then in between that are these two stories about with Jesus and Nicodemus and Jesus and the woman at the well. So I think, it's my opinion, but I think there's John's intentionally structuring his book overall and putting these stories in a particular order in a certain way, because those contribute to understanding what he's doing in the book as a whole. And so there'll be sections of the book that may have a different focus. We see that as well from John chapter 5 through John chapter 12. It's really a series of stories that demonstrate the unbelief of those in Jesus's day. Because if you look carefully at it, that's really the focus. John 5, the unbelief of the Pharisees. John 6, the unbelief of the crowds. John 7, 8, and 9, again, the unbelief of the Pharisees and different events and the Jewish leaders. And so I think, because again, remember, John's gospel, the intent was that the reader would believe, right? So faith, belief is an important theme in his gospel. And so he gives in John 4, right, the Samaritans are an example of belief. But then the very next chapter begins this series of stories that show the unbelief of those around Jesus. And in John 6 is the sober truth of Judas's unbelief, that even one of the disciples did not believe. If you remember, end of chapter 6, John threw that comment in at the very end that one of you will betray me. Like, seems very out of place. You know, he told this whole story about the disciples who left him, and then how Peter says, you know, we won't leave you. Where would we go? You have the words of eternal life, right? So we see that contrast between the belief and the unbelief. And then right after that, right, it says in John 6, I think we talked about this, where it says Judas would betray him. And you think, why did John throw that in there? That seemed out of place. Until you step back and say, John's really trying to show us and teach us what unbelief looks like. And giving these stories as examples that here Jesus presents who he is demonstrating he's Jesus, the Messiah, demonstrating he's the Son of God, showing he's the Lamb, showing that he's the Messiah. And yet these people continue to reject him. But there are some who believe. And so we really get that all the way through until John 13, when John then describes, you know, the Passion Week, the death, resurrection of Christ in those last 7 or 8 chapters, and then his resurrection appearance. So there's a large structure in the gospel. Really, I would see an introduction section, the beginning, then John 1 through John 3 or 4 is these stories demonstrating that Jesus is in fact the Messiah, and then John 5 through John 12, the nature of unbelief, the rejection of the Messiah, and then 13 to 21, his death and resurrection. But again, we're stepping back and we're saying, okay, these are not random stories that John is telling us, but they actually, he has, as Shulong said, there's an intention of the author to present a message, a purpose through these stories, and they are connected together, connected in a broad sense overall, but then also there's these smaller connections between them as you go through the account. As I said, I would put together John chapters 1 to 4, and then I put together chapters 5 to 12, and then 13 to 21. I think those are broad sections, and then within those, there are particular themes that John is emphasizing that are connected to the bigger theme, the plot of the story overall. Thoughts about that? Comments or questions? Does that make sense?
Well, thank you, Pastor Tim. I've been thinking about. I think in the this is my view. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I think in the Gospel of John, in a way, we are helped because John stated his purpose statement in John 20:31. So it's kind of like a kite. It's a kite flying in the sky that you can always keep that in mind when we read through the Gospel of John. Secondly, we are also helped by the prologue in the first 18 verses of John chapter 1. So that seems to be like the lights at the lighthouse is shining at us, and then there is the kite. There's a purpose statement. So when we read the narratives in John chapter 3, chapter 4, as you were saying just now, I was thinking, is John illustrating from John 3, 4, even 5 onwards, that what was stated in, I think, verse 10, 11 of John chapter 1, he came to his own, but his own did not receive him. I think it's verse 11. And yet, to those who receive him, he gave them the right to become children of God. Not born of human descent, not born of human will, but by God's will, I think. So that helped us. That is kind of my take as you were talking. And the second point is I felt that it is a lot more difficult, or rather it takes a lot more, I don't know, many more hours or weeks or months of work when we have to look at a big narratives, but like the book of Genesis. Because we can't find a purpose statement, and then we don't have an epilogue so-called. So it's a little bit kind of trying to figure out what is the main point of that particular narratives. And so it brings me to my third point, which is a question. I'm not sure I'm jumping ahead of what you have planned. We have been working through the Genesis 22 of Abraham was asked to sacrifice Isaac. So as you were talking, I was thinking, what is the plot in Genesis 22? Where are the conjunctions that I must pay attention in order to help me to figure out, hey, that is the main point. So my question is this. In Genesis 22, I'm not sure if I'm jumping ahead. Please say, keep it for the next 3 weeks and that question. So my question is, what is the plot in Genesis 22? I mean, up to verse 19, all right? Is the plot is found in verse 12, that the narrator in this case, Moses say, let me read from the ESV, verse 12, where the angel of the Lord actually say, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know, because now I know you fear God. All right, and you have not withhold him from me. So it's the plot that God is testing Abraham, and God is coming to a conclusion through the statement of the angel. Because now I know, because of your willingness to sacrifice Isaac, you obey in a very prompt manner. You went up the next morning, you did not delay, and things like that. That the plot is that now I know you fear God. Or the plot is further down in that narrative that God will always provide. So that is where I actually struggle. In fact, in my Monday night class with Professor Sean Ransom and so on, it's always how to say, is an exegesis skill, I guess, is to keep asking what is the main point, because we can be so off track preaching Genesis 22 about the obedient son in the persons of Isaac, or the faith of Abraham, in obeying God promptly, and missed the main point as a main point.
Yeah, and we're actually gonna do Genesis 22 as an example, going through the plot of the story. So we'll save the answer to your question at that point. But I think for the exegete, this is if I could summarize everything we're covering in all these genres and modules and discussions, it's this is the question the exegete must be asking all the time. Why did the author put this here?
Yeah.
That's, if you can answer that question, you know the passage. And that question can, why did the author put this here? There could be several answers to that. Why is Genesis 22 even in the book of Genesis? Why did Moses put it here after Genesis 21 and before Genesis 23? Why did he put what he put in the story? I think a really good example is Judah and Tamar in Genesis 38.
Yeah.
That story just sticks out like, what is that doing here? Because you have this narrative, Joseph narrative, that starts in 37 and goes to 50, right? And what? I thought this was about Joseph. Why does he throw Judah and Tamar in here? And it's like a really sordid tale. It's, this immoral, this father-in-law, hiring out his daughter-in-law as a prostitute, just like, it's bizarre and unsettling and doesn't seem to fit.
Yeah.
Unless we understand this principle that there is a connection. And I think actually in the Shepherds Conference, Austin Duncan preached on Judah and Tamar. And I thought he did a good job of showing its connection to the book. And it makes sense when you understand what Moses is trying to accomplish in the whole book, and understand then the Judah and Tamar wasn't just some disconnected account that, with the message of don't be with a prostitute. That's not at all the point of the story. Certainly that's a true statement. Don't be with a prostitute. I mean, that's right. But that's not why Moses put it there. And I don't think it's just about Judah in contrast to Joseph. That's where a lot of people talk about. I think there's some things there, Judah as a wicked brother, and Joseph in contrast. In the very next chapter, he's running from Potiphar's wife. So there may be some connection there, but really we have to think, okay, in the broader picture of the story, in the Joseph narrative, and then even in the purpose of Genesis, what is Judah and Tamar doing there? We'll talk more about that. I think that's probably a really, really good example of just this point I'm trying to make here about, these narratives are intentionally connected stories to convey a message. And you won't get Judah and Tamar unless you understand that principle. Judah and Tamar just doesn't make sense. Genesis 22, you know, Abraham and Isaac, same kind of thing. What's that doing here? Is this just a random story that Moses throws in to show the faith of Abraham? Or is there something about it that's connected to the bigger theme of the Pentateuch? And I think there is. And I think that's something we'll go through that example a little bit later, maybe next week, actually, and hopefully see that. But that's what you want to be thinking. Okay, how is this story connected to the stories around it? And what's its connection to the point of the book, to the plot of the book? Now, as you said, Yuchai, you know, John was very explicit. Even Luke was explicit, right? He begins his gospel giving a reason or a purpose for a book. Most of the narrative, most of the other books of the Bible don't do that.
Yep.
But there is a purpose behind each of the books. It just takes more work on our part to figure that out, because the author doesn't always say, hey, this is why I'm writing this book. This is the point of the story. We usually don't get that. We have to figure it out from understanding each of the stories in the book and how they may connect together and what seems to be the plot or the message through those events. I mentioned this earlier, and we'll have to close with this, that narratives are not just historical narratives, they're historical theology. That is, you know, these narrative books in the Bible aren't just describing events that took place so that we know the history. Certainly they do that. They give us history. But their intent was not just to give us history. They actually are stories with a plot that have a message. Right? Many times history books don't necessarily have a plot. They just tell us the events that happened with the particular country or time period. But the Bible is not a bunch of history books. They're a historical theology. That is, that there's a theological message and theme being given through the stories that the author presents. Just like in the epistles, just like in poetry, just like in the prophetic books. There's a message being given through the book to the original audience. Narratives are no different. They can just be a little bit more challenging in figuring out that message, and you'll have sort of the subplots in the smaller stories that the author is using as well to communicate connected themes as well. All right, so we'll dig deeper into the idea of plot. Lord willing, next week we'll spend time in Genesis 22 as an example of that, understanding the plot of Genesis 22, and then seeing how does that story fit within the broader plot or narrative of Genesis and even the Pentateuch, right? Okay.
Thank you.
So yeah, this is, for me, narratives are really, I think, the most challenging, figuring out what is the author saying here, because we often import or impose our own thoughts on, these stories, because, we see things, but sometimes we will miss then why the author put it there. And that's the Holy Spirit inspired meaning that we need to figure out, like Genesis 38, Judah and Tamar, again, the message isn't sexual purity. There's another message that Moses intends to give us that's connected to the book overall, that we need to understand. Certainly we can learn by examples from the Old Testament, of what to do and not to do, but we have to be careful that we don't make that the main message of the author. Okay. All right. Well, it's good to be back together. I'm thankful for you, brothers. I know it's late there, so I'll let you go. But Lord willing, we'll pick it up next week and talk further about plot and do an example together. Okay. Brother Daniel, I'd like to ask if you would be willing to close us in prayer.
Yeah, all right.